Welcome to the Engines of Texanity, Episode 3, The Republic of Cotton. I'm Brandon Seale. On September 30th, 1830, Juan Martín de Beramendi appeared before the governor, secretary of state, and speaker of the Coahuila y Texas state legislature. The 52-year-old Beramendi had just 3 weeks prior been chosen as the vice governor of Coahuila, and he was accompanied on this occasion by his family, including his 19-year-old daughter, Ursula. A native of San Antonio, Beramendi had done well for himself as a merchant, an occasional contrabandista in the years following the Battle of Medina, when he and many of his fellow Tejanos had taken exile in Natchitoches, Louisiana. In Louisiana, Beramendi and other Tejanos had deepened their pre-existing commercial connections with the Anglo-American frontier economy and became convinced of the advantages of bringing Anglo-American immigrants and Anglo-American capital back into their impoverished province. In fact, it had been Beramendi, along with Erasmo Seguin, who had met Stephen F. Austin in Natchitoches in 1821 with the news that his petition to settle an Anglo colony in the state had been approved. Yet Beramendi had never been as personally invested in the drive to bring Anglo-Americans to Texas as he was at this moment. Because standing next to him, or perhaps next to his daughter, Ursula, was a 34-year-old Anglo named Jim Bowie. Beramendi had arranged for Jim Bowie to be granted Mexican citizenship by no less than the legislature of Coahuila y Texas by vouching for him personally. Why was Beramendi doing this? How did Jim Bowie fast-track himself into the ranks of Coahuila y Texas' first family so quickly? Bowie had just rolled into San Antonio earlier that year. He presented himself as a man of means, which presumably helped, declaring the value of his collective properties to be $222,800, an absolutely fantastic sum that would have probably made him wealthier than every man, woman, and child in Tejano, Texas combined. It was, by almost any reckoning, however, false. In the previous decade in Louisiana, Bowie had engaged in a series of land speculations involving hundreds of thousands of acres. Many of these transactions were shady. Many more were outright fraudulent. But he got away with it, for a while anyhow, because Louisiana was in the middle of a land rush, with land prices skyrocketing from 40 cents an acre to $1 an acre over the course of just a few years. There's a decent chance that Bowie and Beramendi had gotten to know each other in the post-Battle of Medina years in Natchitoches. In any case, sometime during the 1820s, Bowie became aware of how cheap land could be got in Texas, compared to the $1 an acre it had surged to in Louisiana, where his land schemes and debt collectors were starting to catch up to him anyway. Even for honest land speculators, things in the United States had become much more difficult. Following the Panic of 1819, the U.S. government stopped selling land on credit. After 1820, purchasers now had to put up $100 cash, and the new starting price was $1.25 an acre. In Texas, however, Stephen F. Austin was soon offering a league and a labor, about 4,600 acres, for 12.5 cents an acre, 1/10 of the price, and on credit. But for a guy like Jim Bowie, even that still felt like buying retail. He had heard, perhaps from his Natchitoches Tejano connections, that Mexican citizens could claim up to 11 leagues of land, almost 50,000 acres, for 5 cents an acre. Jim Bowie decided to become a Mexican citizen. And fortunately for him, Juan Martín de Beramendi decided to sponsor him. Not only sponsor him, he agreed to marry off his eldest daughter, Ursula, to him. Which still, of course, doesn't actually answer the question, why was perhaps the most prominent Tejano politician of the moment going all in on this Bowie character, whose main source of renown was slave smuggling, real estate fraud, and knife fighting? Well, Bowie did commit to pay Beramendi a $15,000 dowry, so maybe that sweetened the pot, although Beramendi had to be skeptical as to whether he'd ever get that money, since Bowie was also simultaneously borrowing $2,500 from Beramendi to take his honeymoon. In any case, that was a private arrangement between the two men. But there was something that Beramendi wanted in the form of a public, notarized commitment in front of the governor, the secretary of state, and the speaker of the state legislature. Let me read you now the language of Bowie's Mexican citizenship grant. Quote, "The Constitutional Congress of the Free, Independent, and Sovereign State of Coahuila y Texas decrees the following. A letter of citizenship is hereby granted to the foreigner, James Bowie, providing he establishes the wool and cotton mills which he offers to establish in the state." End quote. Cotton. Beramendi was willing to take a flyer on Bowie because of cotton and because of Bowie's promises to help bring the miracle of the cotton economy deep into Coahuila y Texas. Recall that after the devastation and depopulation following the Battle of Medina, Texas was perhaps the poorest province in the new Mexican nation. Per capita, Tejanos had something like 1/278th the wealth of the residents of Mexico City, and the entire product of Texas totaled something less than 1/1000th the total of all of Mexico. The last Spanish governor wrote in 1819 that Tejanos were, quote, "so distressed, dejected, and desperate," end quote, that he believed they might abandon Texas entirely. And he added, quote, "I'm in a quandary because I don't consider that I have a right to stop them," end quote. Indeed, it had been their exile in Louisiana that had brought Tejanos to witness firsthand how the cotton economy was transforming the southern United States. Since the days of Spanish Texas's first capital at Los Adais right next door, Natchitoches had been a crossroads of Native American traders, old Tejano smugglers, French and now Anglo-American merchants. The shift in trade goods in the early 1800s is telling of the magnitude of the economic revolution that was occurring, however. Historically, the largest Texas exports had been hides and tallow from the wild cattle roaming the province. In the early 1800s, those were surpassed by horses, destined for the booming cotton farms of the Mississippi Delta. And the most traded item in return to Texas? Textiles, finished cotton products. Finished textiles were as valuable as horses, in a province and in a moment where horses were the most valuable and liquid forms of wealth. The going conversion rate amongst Lipan Apaches anyway was 2 blankets for a pony, and a really well-made blanket could fetch a full-grown horse. We absolutely take for granted how the industrialization of textile production has changed our lives. That pair of jeans you're wearing, that represents 6 miles of thread and would have required 100 man-hours, or woman-hours more likely, in pre-industrial times to make. The spinning jenny, the power loom, and the water frame industrialized processes that previously had all been performed by hand, radically reducing the price and thus radically expanding the market for textiles. All of this, however, depended on a large supply of raw cotton. Egypt had some, India had a lot, but no region would prove so conducive to cotton production as the American South. The tipping point for American cotton cultivation seems to have been the invention by Eli Whitney of a cotton engine, a word Americanized into a cotton gin later on, a machine to separate the cotton seeds from the pure fibers of a raw cotton boll by machine rather than by hand. The improvement was pronounced. The most skilled slave, because the American cotton boom was built on slave labor, more on this later, could clean maybe 4 pounds per day of cotton. Eli Whitney's cotton gin could process 40 pounds a day. And pair that cotton gin with other industrial advances like the steam engine, and soon you had automated gins that could put out 4,000 pounds per day. This was, as they say in business school, a step change. As we've seen with the horse and with flood irrigation, technological improvements that create these kinds of multiples of return on investment create a momentum of their own. Between 1794 and 1800, nearly every tobacco farmer in the lower Mississippi converted their farms to cotton. While the non-Indian population of Spanish Texas floundered around maybe 3,000 people between 1810 and 1820, the population of Louisiana doubled from 77,000 to 153,000. Mississippi more than doubled, from 31,000 in 1810 to 75,000 in 1820. And Alabama's growth was even more impressive, from 9,000 in 1810 to 128,000 in 1820. You see now why land prices had skyrocketed from 40 cents to $1 an acre. Cotton volumes followed suit. In 1796, cotton production around Natchez, Mississippi totaled 36,000 pounds. 4 years later, by 1800, it was 1.2 million pounds. Aided by a doubling of cotton prices from 15 to 30 cents a pound, by 1820, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama were producing 40 million pounds of cotton per year. So why hadn't this boom extended into Mexico? It's a particularly interesting question, especially when I tell you that by 1820, nearly every pound of cotton produced in the American South was descended from Mexican cotton. Just as the cotton boom was starting to gain steam in the American South, a mysterious pestilence known as the rot swept through the Gulf Coast cotton fields and threatened to strangle the infant industry before it even took off. A few years prior, however, a Mississippi planter in Mexico City on business had smuggled out the seeds of a particularly high-quality pre-Columbian strain of cotton. Not only was this Mexican strain found to be immune to the rot, when crossed with the prevailing southern strains, it produced just a flat-out superior plant all around. The Mexican hybrid had longer fibers, ripened more quickly, its bolls all ripened at the same time, which vastly improved harvest efficiency, and even the way the bolls opened up made the cotton easier to pick out. Taken together, a single field hand could now pick 3 to 4 times as much Mexican cotton as they could with the previous strains. There's a few reasons why Mexico didn't benefit from these developments. One, Mexico didn't have major navigable rivers. By contrast, the American Southeast is crisscrossed by gently sloping navigable streams. Cheap cotton depended on cheap transport. The prevailing overland freight rates for much of the 19th century in the U.S. were around 20 cents per ton mile, something expressed usually as $1 per 100 pounds per 100 miles. When the same steam engines now powering cotton gins were installed on American paddle wheel packet boats, processed cotton could be shipped from almost anywhere in the inland United States to the coast for pennies a pound. Mountainous Mexico had no similar advantage, at least not over nearly so large an expanse of its geography as the U.S. 2, the industrial-scale cultivation of cotton ran up against another challenge in Mexico: the Hispanic tradition's discomfort with chattel slavery. The American cotton economy was built on plantation slavery. Between 1810 and 1860, the number of slaves in the American South grew from 1 million to 3.5 million, 40% of the total population. Some states, like Mississippi, were more than 50% slaves. Mexico, by contrast, had abolished slavery in 1829. Sort of. To be fair, Mexican agriculture was no shining beacon of free labor. Some pretty horrible labor conditions existed at the bottom end of the social ladder throughout Mexican labor history as well, from the encomienda given to conquistadors over the lives of their Indians, to the repartimiento of Indian labor to their overlords, to the forced levies or mitas of the mines, or to debt peonage, which was the preferred method of involuntary servitude in 19th century Mexico. Yet none of these systems of labor exploitation proved nearly as effective as slavery at organizing cotton cultivation. Lastly, number 3, there was one thing that Mexican planters could never replicate or compete with: the Anglo-American system of credit. The cotton economy was built on credit, extending from English mills to London insurance agencies to New England ships to New York banks to New Orleans trading houses and all the way down to the planters themselves. Hard currency almost never traded hands. Sellers were paid in credits that they could use on the next transaction, which meant that buyers only needed to have enough currency to cover the difference between the agreed price and what the seller wanted to roll forward, which was often almost everything. We forget these days that there's a lot of ways to increase the money supply in a society other than just the Federal Reserve moving the interest rate. People expand the money supply every time they create and accept IOUs to each other, which is something that the Anglo-American system got very good at in the 1800s. You can pick your reasons as to why: good rule of law, high levels of social trust, almost unlimited land to act as collateral, assuming you disregarded the claims of the native inhabitants living there, of course. A few Tejanos, especially those who took refuge in Louisiana after the Battle of Medina, got plugged into this Anglo-American credit system a little, or at least they got a taste of it. And yet even then, they often needed Anglos, like Jim Bowie, to act as intermediaries for them to really access it. This was what a man like Jim Bowie offered Juan Martín de Beramendi, who, by the way, never got his cotton mill from Bowie. It seems like Bowie tried to order it, but Beramendi and his daughter Ursula died in a cholera epidemic in 1833, and Bowie, of course, was dead 3 years after that. Beramendi's strategy was sound, economically at least. It was, and it would prove to be, the best hope for Texas's economy at the time, as long as you understood all that entailed. And everyone at the time understood all that entailed. Stephen F. Austin put it bluntly, quote, "The primary product that will elevate us from poverty is cotton, and we cannot do this without the help of slaves," end quote. 25% of the human beings entering Texas with his famed first 300 families were enslaved. Actually, technically, they were permanently indentured servants. Working together with allies in the Coahuiltecan legislature, Tejano lawmakers and Anglo-American planters came up with a loophole to allow for the importation of slaves into Mexican Texas by having these immigrating slaves sign indenture contracts for 99 years for their labor in favor of their masters. They were just indebted peons. Slavery in all but name. No one at the time tried to portray slavery as a benevolent institution. The work of raising and picking cotton was grueling. You planted it in February. You spent the next 2 months protecting the seedlings daily from encroaching weeds, grasses, and pests. In April, you thinned out the rows, manually inspecting and selecting the strongest plants. Rain, of course, brought more weeds and grasses and pests, which had to be scraped and pulled by hoe or by hand throughout the summer, until harvest time, when every hand available, man, woman, and child, worked picking the fibers from out of the surprisingly sharp bolls, hunched over, hands bleeding. Skilled pickers were expected to pick a couple 100 pounds per day. That's something like 20,000 bowls, maybe 30 bowls per minute. That's not a happy zippity-doo-dah pace. That's maniacal. And it appalled most Mexican observers. Future first Vice President of Texas, Lorenzo de Zavala, during his tour of the United States in 1833, struggled to reconcile his admiration for the new American Republic with, quote, "this degrading traffic, the vestiges of so humiliating a condition of the human race," end quote. In particular, he noted the hypocrisy of a nation so enchanted with newspapers and free speech that still felt the need to pass laws criminalizing the advocation of abolition or even of educating slaves. Quote, "Sad indeed is the situation of a state where its legislators consider necessary such offensive measures of repression against the rights of man," end quote. Of course, none of this was appalling enough to prevent de Zavala from taking out an impresario contract himself in East Texas, which he in turn marketed to cotton planters no less than Stephen F. Austin had. The economic returns were too powerful to ignore, I suppose, as long as you didn't tally the human suffering involved. In 1830, Texas produced 400,000 pounds of cotton, pretty much entirely from the Anglo-American areas, and though not a huge number by the standards of the neighboring U.S. states, it represented something like $40,000 of gross domestic product in a state whose Tejano population collectively might have held less than $100,000 worth of net worth. By 1835, that number, the cotton production, was 8 times as much, something like 3.15 million pounds of cotton sold that year. One estimate placed the value of the cotton trade at something like $500,000 per year at this time, which would mean that Texas, over the course of a single decade, had gone from 1/1000th of the Mexican economy to, and let this number sink in, something like 1/16th of it. But we should be more precise with our words, because the truth is that Texas's cotton economy was never really part of the Mexican economy. Texas's cotton economy was oriented almost entirely to New Orleans, and by proxy to the United States. After just a few years of this, even the Tejanos in Texas, one Mexican contemporary grumbled, quote, "are not Mexicans except by birth. Accustomed to the continued trade with the North Americans, they have adopted their customs and habits," end quote. By 1835, Tejanos, though, were badly outnumbered by Anglos. I've never found settled numbers on this, but most estimates I find place the Anglo population in 1835 at well over 20,000, as compared to maybe 4,000 Tejanos in the entire state. Indeed, by 1835, Tejanos were almost certainly outnumbered by slaves in Texas. All of this created a powerful economic rationale for the Texas Revolution of 1835-36. Not just that East Texas was now more economically integrated with the United States than with Mexico, but because there was an easy and glaring economic arbitrage opportunity staring Anglo and Tejano landowners in the face. It was the value of their land. How much more valuable would Texas cotton lands be worth if they were no longer stuck behind a deeply unstable Mexican government, which was becoming increasingly vocal, if not particularly effective, at abolishing slavery. We actually don't have to imagine how large this arbitrage opportunity was. Within a few years of Texas's independence, cotton lands that had been worth 12.5 cents an acre were selling for 45 cents an acre, a more than threefold increase. This would not have been unforeseeable to the men fighting for Texas independence. After independence, during the Republic years, there was still a risk premium associated with cotton lands in this new, unstable republic that discounted the value from the $1.25 an acre that the same lands would have gone for in the U.S. But still, by any reckoning, Texas independence was what finance guys today would describe as an immediately accretive transaction. But the timing of a cotton republic couldn't have been worse. The Panic of 1837 in the United States crippled Texas cotton planters' access to capital. And then, cotton prices collapsed from about 15 cents a pound in 1835 to as low as 5 cents a pound over the course of the decade of Texas's independence. This devastated the finances of the Republic. Texas tried printing money, which quickly declined to less than 50% of its face value and then plummeted to 10%. Though in a clever piece of marketing, the government made sure to print a picture of a cotton plant in full open bowl bloom on the face of their $3 bills to remind everyone what was backing their currency. But in the end, the Republic of Texas government largely fell back on borrowing from the same merchant houses in New Orleans that individual Texas cotton planters relied on to carry their debt. By 1842, Texas's national debt was out of control, and the government stopped even trying to service it. For the first time, land prices in Texas dropped down to 25 cents an acre, even for good cotton lands along the Brazos. It didn't help that the Republic had been unsuccessful in getting U.S. tariffs on imported Texas cotton reduced. At 3 cents a pound, they constituted almost half of the value of the product, leaving Texas cotton producers at a pronounced competitive disadvantage. There was, of course, a quick fix for this. An action that would double the price that Texans were getting for their cotton by eliminating the U.S. tariff. An action that would instantly make Texas cotton lands and Texas landowners worth 5 times as much by placing their land on an equal economic footing to the $1.25 an acre land of the American South. No Texas landowner would have been unaware or insensitive to this opportunity. And I'm talking, of course, about annexation to the United States. In economic terms, it's not a surprise that Texans voted 7,664 in favor as compared to 430 against joining the United States in 1845. Some landowning Tejanos and those who were able to integrate themselves a bit into the cotton-based economy enjoyed some of the benefits of these increasing land prices, like Juan Seguin at first. But Seguin's arc serves better as a tragic parable of the societal changes that occurred during the Texas Cotton Republic's years. Most Tejanos still were never really able to fully access the system of credit that fueled the Anglo-American engine, and hence weren't able to really fully partake in the economic life of the nation. First independence and then annexation were dual blows to Tejanos' earlier status as power brokers in the region. A frustrated former San Antonio mayor, Francisco Antonio Ruiz, argued unsuccessfully at the time of the annexation vote that only those Texans who had participated in the War for Independence should have been allowed to vote on annexation. When the measure passed, he went to live with the Comanches instead, out of disgust. You can't understate the role of cotton in the growth and economy of 19th century Texas. By 1860, and the outbreak of the American Civil War, which cotton carried Texas into, the census counted more than 600,000 non-Indians living in Texas. Again, this up from maybe 3,000 in 1820. Of course, fully 1/3 of those 600,000 had not come to Texas of their own volition. And that third of the population represented more than 1/3 of the wealth of Texans in 1860. More than $100 million in assessed value, behind only real property, which sat at $120 million on Texans' balance sheet that same year. By 1860, that $120 million capital base with $100 million of slave labor working it was producing 200 million pounds of cotton per year, representing something like $10 million a year of domestic product. But cotton isn't even something we should talk about in the past. Texas cottonlands never stopped expanding. The economics of the railroad, more on that later, pulled cotton farmers further and further west, out onto the high plains. And today, cotton has been raised in 238 of Texas's 254 counties. Nowadays, in fact, none of the top producing cotton counties are back in the old East Texas bottomlands. Today, they're all in the high plains. The leading county, Lubbock County, regularly produces 200 million pounds per year by itself, as much as the entire state of Texas produced in 1860. And the state at large today produces something like 3 billion pounds per year of cotton, 40% of the U.S. total, and something like 5% of the world total. Cotton was such a part of Texans' identity that when Dallas boosters proposed to host the Texas Centennial Expedition in 1936, they renamed a football stadium an associated bowl game in the middle of the fairgrounds based on a cotton pun. A cotton bowl, of course. It was a nod to the significance of cotton in Texas history, something which Texans in 1936 were not particularly shy about, since cotton was still probably the third most important industry in Texas at the time, behind only newcomers' oil and lumber. But today, the legacy of cotton is something that Texans have become increasingly uncomfortable with, I'm sure because of its obvious associations with slavery. Later 20th century versions of Texas history came to favor the story of the cowboy and cattle drives. There's something far more romantic about a man on a horse than a man with a hoe, particularly when that man with the hoe is an enslaved one. We heard in the previous episode how the Spanish system of flood irrigation had helped the Spanish establish permanent footholds in Texas. And yet through all the years of Spanish Texas, the province remained a, quote, decidedly Indian domain, end quote, populated by maybe 40,000 natives compared to just a few thousand Spanish subjects at any one time. The horse, or rather a skilled Plains Indian mounted on a horse, still seemed to hold the advantage over subsistence farmers working their irrigated fields. Indeed, the primary non-economic motivation of Tejanos in supporting Anglo-American immigration into their state was to help import allies, to help them counterbalance the Lipan and Comanche presence. Cotton, very quickly, more than counterbalanced the Indios Bárbaros. Cotton was such a cash crop that it shifted the advantage back to the farmers. Cotton produced more wealth per unit of land, by a long shot, than a horse ever could. Unfortunately, good cotton lands were almost always good horse grazing lands as well. A terrible contest had been set up, pitting a cotton-raising society against the mounted tribes whose need for land couldn't be paid off, even with all the money that the cotton economy was generating. But a new invention was about to arrive on the Texas plains, an invention that would intensify that contest, if not settle it. An invention that became so associated with the state that it was sold in a discreet box made to look like a book labeled The Common Law of Texas. If the Colt revolver can be said to have made Texas, it's also not too much to say that Texas made the Colt revolver. On the next episode of The Engines of Texanity. Thank you for listening. If you haven't read Andrew Torgett's Seeds of Empire, you need to. It's one of the best books of the last few decades on Texas history, dedicated to the outsized role of cotton on the development of the state, and it's the basis for much of this episode. This season is brought to you by the 11th Street River House in Bandera, Texas. Sort of. My wife and I have dreamed for years about owning a place in Bandera, and we finally bought a house there last year. 4 blocks from the bars, 3 blocks from the Frontier Times Museum, with 120 feet of Medina River frontage and a collection of historic Texas maps on the wall, curated by yours truly. It's a great place to spend a weekend and to sort of indirectly support this podcast. Look it up under 11th Street River House on Airbnb or on VRBO. Editing for this episode was performed by Susana Canseco. Sound engineering by Stephen Bennett. Stephen Bennett also composed and performed the theme music. You can find more about Stephen at info@nosomedia.com. nosomedia.com. David Moore designed the cover art for this season. You can find him at illustrationonline.com. For more information on our sources and other projects, please check out www.brandonseal.com.